regret only one murder, and that was of Minnie Williams. Because I think I loved her.
Most people don't realize how fragile history actually is. We like to imagine the past as fixed, a locked record of events that simply waits to be uncovered. But in reality, history is often shaped by repetition, not evidence. The more a story is told, the more permanent it feels. Eventually, questioning it starts to sound suspicious. Few stories prove this better than the legend of Henry Holmes. You've probably heard the outline before. A charming doctor, a strange building in Chicago, secret rooms, hidden chutes, gas chambers, vats of acid. A murder castle, hundreds of victims, America's first serial killer. It's one of the most famous crime stories ever told. And almost none of it survives careful examination. Welcome to Noir Frame. To understand how this story formed, you have to understand the world it came from. Late 19th century America was chaotic in a way that's difficult to imagine now. Cities like Chicago were growing faster than their system could handle. People arrived by the thousands every week, many with no documentation, no fixed address, and no intention of staying long. If someone disappeared, there was no centralized way to notice, no national records, no shared databases. A person could simply vanish into another state, another city, or another life. At the same time, newspapers were becoming mass entertainment. Competition was fierce, attention was currency, and fear sold better than facts. Sensation wasn't a side effect of reporting, it was the business model. This was the environment Henry Holmes stepped into. Henry Holmes wasn't born Henry Holmes. His real name was Herman Webster Mudgett. And long before he was accused of murder, he was already committing fraud. While studying medicine, he learned how to exploit systems built on trust, insurance policies, professional authority, paperwork no one thought to double-check. There's an important distinction here. His earliest crimes weren't violent. They were transactional. Holmes didn't begin as a sadist or a compulsive killer. He began as a con artist who discovered that lying could be profitable. That pattern never changed. The case that brought Holmes national attention wasn't a murder investigation. It was an insurance scheme gone wrong. Benjamin Pettizel, a carpenter and occasional criminal associated with Holmes, took out a life insurance policy. Shortly afterward, a body was discovered in a fire. The body was identified as Pettizel's. The insurance company paid. On paper, it was simple fraud. What complicated everything was Holmes's behavior afterward. He couldn't stop manipulating the story. He gave different explanations to different people. In one version, Pettizel was alive and hiding. In another, the death was accidental. He insisted that Pettizel's children were safe, traveling under assumed names. They weren't. When investigators stopped listening to Holmes and started following his movements, they found real victims. Bodies tied directly to him. Enough evidence to establish that Holmes was not just a fraudster, but a murderer. That should have been the end of it. Instead, it was the beginning of something much larger. As soon as Holmes was arrested, the press took control of the narrative. Chicago newspapers revisited all rumors about a building Holmes owned, a strange, unfinished structure with unusual interior layouts. Earlier articles that once read as curious footnotes were reprinted with darker framing. Speculations filled the gaps where evidence didn't exist. Ordinary architectural quirks became intentional traps. Unfinished rooms became proof of secret designs. Missing people, many of whom had no confirmed connection to Holmes at all, were retroactively assigned to him. The building was given a name, the Murder Castle. The name did more work than any police report ever could. In reality, the building was never a functioning hotel. It didn't host guests. Large portions of it were unfinished. It wasn't even operational during the World's Fair, despite later claims. The structure burned before the legend required it to exist in its most famous form. But logistics don't survive contact with mythology. The public wanted to believe that evil could be engineered. The horror could be built into walls and hallways. A single, contained place felt safer than a world where people vanished for countless, unrelated reasons.
I cannot help the fact that I was a murderer. no more than a poet can help the inspiration to a song, to a song, to a song, to a song.
Well, I think he's certainly America's most gruesome serial killer.
He was a cunning, planning killer.
Holmes was the first person in modern times.
The story simplified chaos. While awaiting execution, Holmes leaned into the role that had been written for him. He began confessing, not once, but repeatedly. Each confession was darker than the last. The number of victims grew, the details became more theatrical. He described himself as born without a conscience, as something inhuman. What rarely gets emphasized is that these confessions were paid for.
In Philadelphia, the trial of H.H. Holmes was basically the biggest thing that had ever happened to the city. Holmes was declared guilty and sentenced to death, and that was also another opportunity for the press to really get involved in the case.
Holmes sold his stories to newspapers, fully aware that exaggeration increased their value, and he had nothing left to lose. Years later, researchers would discover that some of the people Holmes claimed to have murdered were still alive. The confessions didn't collapse under scrutiny. They were simply absorbed into the myth. When modern historians return to primary sources, no bestsellers, no dramatizations, the picture changed dramatically. There were no mass graves, no industrial killing systems, no evidence of hundreds of victims. What emerged instead was something smaller, colder, and far less cinematic.
I took Miss Minnie Williams 8 miles east of Momence upon a freight line that is little used, and ended her life with poison and buried her body.
The wax cylinder confession essentially emphasizes the statement about his love that he had for his victim.
Holmes killed people he knew, people who trusted him, people who stood between him and money. His violence was opportunistic, not compulsive, personal, not ideological. That doesn't make his crimes less real, it makes them less convenient. The reason the legend of Henry Holmes survived isn't because it was accurate, it survived because it was useful. At a time when cities felt uncontrollable, when people disappeared without explanation, and when modern life felt overwhelming, the idea of a single monster provided comfort. It suggested that evil had a shape, a name, a location. Blame could be focused. Systems didn't have to be questioned. Henry Holmes wasn't America's first serial killer, but he may have been America's first mass-produced one, a story printed so often that it eventually replaced the record. And once that happens, correcting it becomes almost impossible, because legends don't fade quietly, they insist on being remembered. Before you go, if this story challenged something you thought you already knew, let me know in the comments. Not what you've heard before, but what surprised you this time. If you want more long-form investigations like this, where myths get taken apart instead of repeated, you can support the channel by liking the video and subscribing to Noir Frame. It helps more than you think. New episodes are on the way. Until next time, stay curious and don't trust a story just because it's been told for a long time. See you on the next one.